Hello, everyone, and welcome back again to the show here on a Monday. To the drive home, you have me, Brian Bales, and listeners of our show here on Monday know that from time to time we do a segment called Good Word for You. And we bring people onto the show, experts that can help us understand how some of the things that we see in Scripture actually are a good word for us. You know, God gave us the Scriptures for lots of reasons, and one is to help us thrive in our faith, not just survive. Jesus himself said that he came that we could have life and life to the full. Yet, if we're honest, the reality is many times we just struggle a little bit with that. And we think for a lot of us that life to the full is something that needs to be waited for. Yet it does not. Listeners, I want you to know that with the help of the Holy Spirit, we can all experience so much more now than many of us do. And so that is one of the reasons we do this segment called A Good Word for You, where, again, as I said, we bring on experts to talk about some struggles and topics that can specifically help us and have life to the full that we apply it. Hence the title, Good Word for You. So here we go. Back on the show again to help us is Brooke Ackerman. She is the CEO and principal of Blueprint Heart and Mind Coaching. You can go to blueprint.heartandmind.com to find out more about there. You can get her contact information, and she will help you on that. But thanks for coming back on the show, Brooke. Always good to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's dive in. Whenever I have you on the show, listeners know that we often open up with a scripture, and then we say, well, what in the world does it look to live that out? Because sometimes it's a lot easier to quote something than live something. And I'm going to give one that at first may seem a little odd, but we're going to go back to the book of Exodus, in the book of Exodus, chapter 20, where we have Moses, the prophet of God, coming down off the mountains with, well, we know them as the Ten Commandments. And the very first one given to us, as listed in verse 3 of Exodus 20, just says this: you shall have no other gods before me. Now you're like, why in the world are we talking about this? Now, you and I know, our listeners may be wondering, because again, at first it might seem like a strange verse, but I want to dig into it a bit, specifically around this idea of idols in our modern world and social media that we're going to talk about a bit. And how do we know, as followers of Jesus Christ, when social media is no longer a tool that I use, but rather it's an unhealthy thing or a tool that we use. So let's start by defining our terms. What is an idol actually? You and I are of the same generation. You are younger than me, but you get the Brady Bunch Hawaii episode reference for any of you of a particular, age. You can look that up if you're not on Google. Because when we talk about this issue of social media, this is going to matter. So help us understand what exactly is an idol as we get started today.
I love that you used the Brady Bunch Hawaii episode.
Yeah, well, there you go.
As soon as you mentioned, it's exactly what I think of when I think of an idol. Because when I was younger, the only time I ever heard the word idol was when they would talk about it in the Bible, and it was always a statue. And I never heard anybody talk about idols in any other context.
Correct.
And so to me, idols were statues. And I remember thinking, how silly that someone would put their trust and faith in a statue. I mean, that's ridiculous. And then, the older I get, the more I realize we put our trust and faith into other things that aren't statues, but quite honestly are just as silly, just as they're not going to produce good things just as much as a statue is not going to produce a good thing. And like you said, it's not the thing in and of itself is not necessarily bad. It's if we treat things at social media as a tool to be used, then that's not good or bad. It's just simply a tool. Just like I don't think of using a paintbrush or a pencil as bad or evil. It's a tool.
Right.
And a wrench, a spatula, they're all tools that help us do a thing. But if I start to use my pencil as a wrench or the wrench for a spatula, then that's when there's a problem. That's when we get into some sticky situations.
Yeah, and I love how you bring that out. Not everything is an idol. It's just neutral. Because, growing up in my experience, and maybe listener, if you're here and you're new to the faith, this is a new concept to you, or maybe if you've grown up in the church, this is something you're very familiar with. Every time that I would think through the lens of idol, it would be something that would be clear up front to me, at least, that could be identified as something that was morally wrong. This is an idol. And of course, many times when we look into scriptures, when we look at Exodus, and when Moses was talking to the people of Israel who had just come out of living in Egyptian culture for over 400 years. I mean, they were actually worshiping physical statues that were supposed to represent deities. And so I'd often think of it through that simplistic but true lens. But one of the things that you brought to the forefront, and this is specifically how we're talking about today, this idea of social media, that it's neither good nor bad, but how do we wield the tool? You use paintbrush or wrench. I like to think of a hammer. Depends upon whose hand it's in, right? And how it's used, whether it's good. Some people can be trying to use it for good, but not so skilled with a hammer. That would be me. Not a good thing. Other people can be skilled. It does a great thing. And then, of course, we know that hammers have been used completely inappropriately for wrong things as well. So we start there because I do think there's a group of people out there who immediately think, oh, here we go again, a group of people just going to be bashing social media. That's not the point of our conversation, but to understand how it stays in its right place. Because you as a coach, you use social media. So talk about from your perspective and what you do there at Blueprint Heart and Mind, how there's obvious benefits there.
Yeah, one of the things I like about it most is that it's a really easy way for me to stay connected to my clients when we're in between doing a session, a one-on-one together. It's a really easy way for me to send them something that I see online that we've talked about, something that would help them further the conversation that we had, keep something at the forefront of their minds. I often think of it as a way to get free coaching because you can go to my social media sites and I put things on there that I'm hoping are helpful to my clients. And it's a way to engage in the coaching that I do with my clients in a way that it fits their schedule. We don't have to find a time together. They can go to those things and see it when it works for them. Another really easy thing about social media for a potential client is if they're considering meeting with me, they can go and see what I'm all about. They can kind of get a taste for my way of coaching. And again, these are just tools that I'm using to help my coaching practice, to help my clients. And when I find good information from other sources, then it's just a really easy way for me to share that information just in general on my coaching page, or specifically I can send something to a client. And I feel like it's almost like rather than going to a store or shopping online for something very, very specific, you can go to social media accounts depending on whose it is and what you're looking for. And it's almost like window shopping or online browsing. You can look for something that you may not have known you needed, but if you're going to a trusted source and they have put good content out on their social media pages, then you are able to absorb good content. And so in that sense, it's a good and healthy tool if we're using it in the way the tool is designed.
Well, I appreciate you bringing that up because I wanted to highlight the fact of what I've experienced from time to time, and maybe our listeners and you as well, is that some ways the irony at best or hypocrisy at worst of people using social media to say social media is a horrible thing. I can't tell you how many times I've like, don't ever use social media on a Twitter page or I guess now X page or Insta page where there's thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of followers. And I'm thinking to myself, you're really missing the heart behind this. You're blaming the tool, not the use of the tool in the wrong way, not the use of the tool. And so there are obviously some good ways, but there are also, and I think some of these things we're more aware of, some things that as we see social media that can invite us and it's an invitation. It doesn't make us do anything, but it does invite us with a really well-crafted narrative one way or the other into some things that are not so pretty. I know that you, as you work with people as a coach, as you work with people and maybe yourself, I know for myself, it is more than a few times I've been like, let's just put that down for a long period of time or for a small period of time because I find what's happening this moment not good. What are some of the things you see it invites people into often?
Unfortunately, I think we often go to social media and we use it as the benchmark or the metric, some way to measure our identity or our self-worth or our value. And wow, if we do that, the water gets muddy very, very quickly because I think we forget that social media, even when used really well, it is not entirely authentic. No matter who you are or how you're using it, it's not entirely authentic because we are considering what we're posting. We're crafting what we're posting. a lot of times people, their social media is very curated. They have
Hmm.
paid very close attention to what they're putting out there and what they're not putting out there. I mean, we have to remember most of the time the pictures we see on social media have been very heavily edited.
Yeah.
Words are carefully crafted. We are editing ourselves so much. There is very little out there on social media that is raw or unfiltered or entirely honest. And that's okay, but we just need to keep that in mind as
Hmm.
we're going to social media. I tell people often, be careful that you aren't comparing your unedited, unfiltered self to somebody else's curated, edited post. Be careful
Yeah.
that you're not comparing your bad day to someone else's modified, airbrushed, photoshopped day.
Hmm.
Because I think we forget that we usually are wanting to put our best foot forward in whatever way that means on social media. And if we're going there comparing ourselves to somebody else, we are getting ourselves into some tricky situations.
You used several words there that made me stop and think that, listeners, oftentimes when I'm interviewing someone you hear on the radio, you're hearing them live audio. I can see them either via, some sort of apparatus like Zoom or Teams or Google Meet. And this happens to be the case right now when I'm talking to Brooke Ackerman. She is the CEO and principal of Blueprint Heart and Mind. And I remember even before I booted up today to talk to you before we get here together for our listeners in the 4 o'clock hour, is that there was an option to hit soft focus to make my
Mm-hmm.
face look less old. And I thought to myself, well, I'll take that. This has been a particularly rough day in that way. And so I'm even presenting myself physically less wrinkled. And certainly when we get into the aspects of looking at another person's life from the outside in and comparing the reality of who we know we are
Mm-hmm.
versus the pretend version of what we think someone else is, that can always be a challenge. Folks, again, I'm talking here today in this segment called A Good Word for You on the Drive Home with Brooke Ackerman. She is the CEO and principal of Blueprint Heart and Mind Coaching. We're talking about social media. How do we know when it's no longer a tool, but one that is unhealthy? We talked about all kinds of things. When we come back, we'll continue talking about some of the invitations social media can invite us to that aren't so pretty. Come on back. We'll be here in a few moments on the Drive Home. Well, it's Monday. We're here at the Drive Home, and wherever you are, whether you're in your car actually driving home, at your home, or at work, or some other place, we're glad that you've joined us here on the Drive Home at WAVA 105.1. And of course, our conversation we're having with Brooke Ackerman, coach, CEO, principal of Blueprint Heart and Mind Coaching, blueprintheartandmind.com, as you can find out about her ministry and what she does there and help people find out who they really are in Christ. And before we went to break, Brooke, we were talking about some of the things that social media can invite us to. We talked about comparison. And really, I think that can lead to this idea of becoming a person who identifies themselves in a way that actually isn't true. I think the word oftentimes is used as false identity. But would you talk about that quickly, especially as we start to say, okay, you've got my attention, Brooke. I need to do some analysis of whether this actually is a tool in my life or it's becoming unhealthy. What is a false identity?
When we use comparison, I mean, there's no way for us to have a sense of true identity because it's the mark is always moving. If I'm always looking at
Yeah.
how I appear or
Hmm.
what my worth is compared to someone else, it's the target is always moving. And so this idea of identity when it's comparison is never true. We need to have a conversation with God and ask him, who do you say I am, Lord? Because that is really our only source of true identity. And that's like pointing true north. We know that's steady, that's constant. And once we know from our Heavenly Father, from the creator of exactly who we are, then we can go from there in life. We can go on social media and be totally fine because we're not looking to social media to define us. Because anytime we are comparing, it's going to lead to jealousy. It's going to lead to a distorted view of who I am, of who everybody else is. And so it can get really messy. And so we just need, again, social media in and of itself, not terrible, not awful, not evil, but we need to keep some things in mind of why we're going there, what we're using it for, and what is it really telling us.
So, how do I know? I mean, I feel like sometimes there are clear markers in my own life where it is okay, this is a problem. Like if I get myself on a particular social media page and I find myself struggling with anger very fast, I'm like, okay, this has a place in my life it shouldn't be. I think most people can relate to that issue, that maybe that's not the best, but not all of them are as clear cut in that way. As you're looking and working with people and trying to help them understand the things that have become idols in their life, essentially replacing God in one way or the other, what would you say, for them to be able to evaluate whether or not it's become unhealthy?
I think a good question to ask ourselves to determine whether or not social media has gone from being a tool to something unhealthy is, what am I asking social media to do for me?
Mm,
Or another way is, what am I looking for on social media? Am I just looking to find information? Am I simply looking to find out what this person is doing and not compare it to what I'm doing? I think that's a really easy way, because if we're looking to social media for validation or confirmation that I'm okay, I may not be doing as well as this person is, but I'm still okay. If we're measuring ourselves against someone else, the whole, how many likes or how many reposts did this thing get that I put out there, when we let that be the way that we measure things, that is a really good indication that social media has become unhealthy, because that's really what an idol is. We are asking it to do something for us that really only God can do.
hmm
And again, God is he's the true source of our identity, and once we know that, everything else can flow from there. But if we're looking for social media to give us a sense of identity, then oof, it's just, I mean, we could talk forever on all the ways that that can go
hmm
sideways.
Well, we've already quoted at least one place from our growing up experience in the Brady Bunch and the Idol. I'm going to give you the great theologian G.I. Joe from growing up.
Mm,
Now we know, but knowing is half the battle.
yes.
And, everyone goes G.I. Joe after
Yeah,
that.
Joe.
Again, aging ourselves today in this conversation. But nonetheless, I say that because there actually is a lot of truth in that statement, whether they recognize the biblical aspects of it or not. Understanding I have a problem,
Mhm.
identifying something as idol is one thing, but having that idol replaced by the truth of Jesus Christ, having that idol removed from our life is the next step. That's why, hey, I know social media is a problem. What do I do? So, say
Mhm.
someone is able to identify with your help or some other way that social media has a wrong place. For some, social media and research has said this out there that in many ways can become an addiction with the dopamine hits. So, there's some other
Mhm.
issues there involved. But let's just say not an addiction, but it's just a problem in their life. How could you give them some suggestions, or rather, would you give them some suggestions about how they can allow social media to go back to a place that it's a tool they're using instead of feeling like that tool is using them?
Yeah, so if social media, maybe like you said, maybe it's not exactly become an idol, but it is starting. You're heading in the direction of an unhealthy. There's really a good reason behind that, and what I mean when I say there's a good reason is that everything God created is good, and the enemy, Satan,
Mm-hmm.
his whole entire goal is to distort every good thing that God has created. And so, in the case of social media, if you've started to rely on that as a source of connection, that might be really what's behind your addiction, your need to go there as often as you're going there. Because really, all of us, every single human being, whether you're the most introverted of introverts, we all still need and want to feel connected to others. And that's how God designed every single one of us. That's part of, it's baked in, it's part of our DNA to be connected to Him and also to each other. And because Satan wants to distort every good thing, he wants to derail true, authentic connection any way he can, and he will use any way he can to get us off track.
Yeah.
And so, if we begin to overly rely on social media to feel a sense of connectedness, what we really need is connection to our Heavenly Father. Because again, if that's our first source of connection is God, then our connections to everyone and everything else will flow from that. And if we lose sight of our first connection to God without, it's not necessarily a conscious thing, it's not necessarily something that we are wanting to choose, but we will look for counterfeit connections and counterfeit relationships because it feels like it's filling the void when it's really, it's a counterfeit. It's giving us a false version.
And the counterfeits, if we're truthful here on the radio, and hopefully we always are, they do feel good lots of times.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think as I was processing what you were saying, I was reminded about this part about we're made to be in relationships. We go back to the garden. We clearly see that God put himself in relationship with Adam, and that was the first relationship that was supposed to happen. But he still looked at the scenario and said, well, it's not good for man to be alone. Let's put, and it wasn't just this man, it's every person. But those earthly relationships are to come through the lens of our heavenly relationship first, of our God, our Father. And certainly we could talk about Genesis chapter 3 and how that got a bit distorted. And, here we are thousands upon thousands of years later, all in many ways making the same mistakes that Adam and Eve made together from time to time. But I don't want to stay in Genesis. I want to go back to where we started in Exodus. One of the key issues in God giving us Exodus chapter 20 is that he is telling us, right, that he should have his proper place in our life. Genesis chapter 1, right? And when he's telling us he should have a proper place in our life, and we're attempting to put him back in this place of preeminence, again, I know he's not there. Something else has taken this place of preeminence. What does it look like then for someone to take some of those steps? I know you've shared a little bit of that for us already, but kind of expand on that if you would.
Sure. And I know that sometimes people get tired of hearing, well, awareness is really important. Being aware is a key first step, but it really is. If you're not aware that it's a problem, then you're not going to do anything about it. And so being aware that we've gone to something else like social media rather than connecting to God is a very necessary first part of the process. And it is a process. And I know sometimes we don't like that either. We just want quick solution right now, but it's a process.
Right.
And so spending time with God purely for connection, just to deepen the relationship. And when I say just, I don't mean like that deepen the relationship is something small or minor. I mean, that is the only reason why we're going to God, because often we go to him for answers.
Yeah.
And if we go to him to spend time with him, that's when we can establish real deep connection, because we want to go to him to answer, well, what do I do in this situation? How do I handle this? Where do I go for this solution to this problem? And he wants to spend time with us. And so also in that is we need to recognize that we have these core needs, real authentic things that every human needs. And when those needs aren't met in authentic ways, again, we get ourselves into some sticky situations. And so we need to sort of tune in internally, and we can ask ourselves questions like, what is it that I truly need right now? Or what core need is not being met right now?
Mm-hmm.
And to take it an even better step further is if we ask God those same questions, because he sees us clearly. And so if we ask him, what is a need right now that is not being met for me? He will point it out to you. And his answers to that are going to be far better than anything we can come up with on our own.
Mm-hmm.
Because if our core need is met in a healthy way, from a place of true connection to the one who created us, then the counterfeits will be easily recognizable as counterfeits. They won't feel as good because it's counterfeit. It's off the mark of what's real and authentic and true from God.
You remind me of an analogy, a friend that we both have reminded me of one time about the best way to know something's counterfeit is to handle the real thing. And
Absolutely.
so that's how they would train bank tellers back in the day, give them real cash. And so once you spend enough time with the real cash, the counterfeit passes through your hands, you know it's there. And so such a vivid reminder, the same, how do we know when something's taken the place of God? Spend more time with God. It'll become much more apparent. So we're talking today with Brooke Ackerman. She is the CEO and principal of Blueprint Heart and Mind Coaching, blueprintheartandmind.com. We're talking about this idea of social media as a tool, not good or bad, just a tool. But how do we know when it's moved from the place of a tool to something that is unhealthy in our life? We'll continue this conversation when we come back from the break. We'll get a couple suggestions of maybe some ways how we can do some preventative maintenance in our life in that way, but also some other things I'm sure you'll want to listen to. This is Drive Home here on a Monday. Thanks for listening to me here at 105.1 WAVA. We'll be back in just a few moments. Once again, we're enjoying our conversation here today with Brooke Ackerman. She is the CEO and principal of Blueprint Heart and Mind coaching, and at blueprintheartandmind.com is where you can find her. And one of the things that she's helping us do is understand the role of social media, how it is but a tool. But if we're not careful, it can take the place of other things, more specifically, the place of God in our life. In Exodus chapter 20, the verse that we started with in this segment, in verse 3 says, we're to have no other gods before us. And so as we've sort of wandered around this conversation a bit today, Brooke, we've been talking about people who may already have a problem. But there's this wonderful thing that my medical doctor keeps telling me called preventative medicine. And they remind me that it's a whole lot easier to not have blood sugar problems than to get rid of blood sugar problems. And there's a list of other things they remind me of in my age. And so, hey, there's could be people listening right now where they're still using it healthily, or maybe they're just right on the edge. That's where my A1C is right now. I'm not there yet. I'm right on the edge. What might you suggest for them to make sure that they don't let it kind of go over that line and being an unhealthy part of their life?
Again, I mentioned it before, but I feel like it's worth mentioning again, kind of taking stock of the reasons why you're going to social media and what you're using it for. It's just a good way to stay balanced. Just kind of check in, like you said, preventative medicine. You go to the doctor to check in. So check in with your heart and mind as well, because we're not just physical beings. We have this whole mental and emotional thing going on too. And so if you find yourself going to whatever your preferred social media apps are unconsciously, that's a good indication that it's gone from being a tool that you use to something unhealthy. And when I say unconsciously, I mean, I know I've done it. I'm scrolling mindlessly before I'm even aware that I'm scrolling.
I think I heard someone talk about it as doom scrolling. You just sort of start and then you wind up in this cycle of you look up and you've been there. Like, how long have I been looking at this?
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah. You just get sucked in and you don't even realize it. Or, you're scrolling and you are kind of aware and you think to yourself, why am I on here? What am I doing? But you keep scrolling. It's almost like there's a part of your brain that shuts off. And that's actually, we're not going to get into all the brain science of it, but that actually does happen. You're aware, but your brain's not letting you disconnect. And so sometimes you need to physically interrupt that. And so put your device down, walk away from it, like literally walk away from it. I silence my notifications for social media often. I don't allow it to be a constant interruption throughout my day. And I will set, because I use it as a tool for coaching, I will set aside specific time, and I will set aside a specific amount of time where it's part of my daily tasks of my job. And so I will go there and I will check things, or I will post things, but it's a set amount of time and it's a specific amount of time. And then I close it down. And again, no notifications. A friend of mine, actually, I loved this. This was a while ago that he said this. He noticed that he was going to social media very often. And so he found an app that connected to his social media. And each time he would want to go to his social media app, this other app would first prompt him to do some form of a deep breathing exercise. And after he would do the deep breathing, he would find that he really didn't want to go to the social media account. Because we're going there for something other than information or using it as a tool. And he even said that sometimes knowing that he would have to go through this extra step was so frustrating and annoying that he just didn't go to it at all. And so whatever works for you. But I mean, find a different activity that actually brings you fulfillment and joy. Take a walk, read a book, listen to music. If you play an instrument, play music. Just, something that actually fosters authentic, true connection is going to be way better than just mindlessly scrolling.
And, we're not here to push apps or those sort of things, but if you want to know what that app is, I bet you Brooke Ackerman knows. I'm just going to tell you, go to blueprintheartandmind.com, click on the information. She'd be happy to connect you there and just stay there while you're there, browse around, take a look at some of the resources that she makes it available for you to help you live the life and the life to the full that Jesus died for. So say someone's listening today, Brooke, and they're like, oh, this has been me. One of the natural reactions to the truth that we look at in the mirror of life sometimes is shame. Shame we know is not of God. That's of the enemy. But rather, God wants to invite us into that relationship when we recognize something is off. But yet, instead of being invited into a relationship, which we always are, and accepting that invitation, we can choose to isolate from God when this happens, whether it's social media or any other thing that comes before him. And he's the best person, we know this, qualified. He's best qualified to answer our prayers, resolve our spiritual issues over all things. Well, why is it a better choice, even when it's hard, to use an overused term, lean in?
Well, as you said, God is the only one who truly sees us clearly. We really don't see ourselves clearly, and we think we do, but we really don't. And if we are relying solely on ourselves, which that's what isolating is, we don't want to let anybody else in. We don't want anybody else to see the messy. We put the soft filter on. We blur the background. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. We social
And
media are a whole physical presence, not just our
oh,
online
it,
presence.
for sure. Absolutely. If we do that, it's like we are looking through a pair of eyeglasses or contacts that are the incorrect prescription. Our vision is distorted, and quite frankly, we need help. And wow, we don't like that idea, right? We really like this idea of I can do it myself, but we can't. And so asking God for his view and his interpretation is always a good idea. It's never going to be a bad thing for you. It might feel uncomfortable at first, but it will always produce good results relying on him rather than ourselves, because he designed each one of us and he
Hmm.
knows each of us very intimately. And so then, if you think about it, why would you not go to the designer, the creator, when there's a problem or an issue or a question? Because, when there's something goes wrong with my car, I don't even attempt to fix it myself because I don't see clearly when it comes to car problems. I take it to a mechanic because the mechanic sees far more clearly than I do. And so if we think about our mental and emotional states like that, why going to the one, and in this case, God, who sees more clearly and who understands our hearts and minds far better than we do, that again, it will always produce better results than me isolating, me shutting down, me relying on myself.
I want to say this. Just thank you for that reminder about where to go. And I think as we close our time together, for someone who says, all right, I get this in general, go to God. Um, but that almost seems strange for them. What does that look like to do that? We can talk about that more at another time. And we have talked about it many times whenever you're here on the drive home, but they don't even know how to start, to use that term, so to speak, lean in. Could you give us some real practical suggestions about what that looks like in people's life?
Yeah, again, God designed us for connection, and that includes the people that he has put into our lives.
Hmm.
And so if you know someone, family member, friend, mentor, whomever it is that you know is a healthy person in your life, and they just seem to have a really good connection to God, and they seem to be able to do this whole lean in thing really well, ask them to share with you what that's like. Ask them what their process is, and not that we're then going to duplicate their process, but we have to start somewhere. And so ask them, what's the effect of you doing that on your mental and emotional health? How is that helpful? Because we are not meant to navigate this life alone. And sometimes the people in our lives aren't necessarily someone very close personally, but they could be a literary mentor. And there
Right.
are so many good resources out there about connection to God. Because while we're talking about social media, really at the bottom of this is, where are we going for real connection? And so spend time with God, not asking questions. Where should I go? What should I do? He will answer those. You can ask those, but if you just spend time with him like you'd hang out with a friend, you can just hang out with God. He's not too busy. And honestly, if you initiate hangout time with him, he would be delighted. It's
Yeah.
really interesting the effect that we have on the heart of our Father as much as he has an effect on us.
For those people out there like, oh, you mentioned there's resources out there
Mhm.
connecting. Obviously, blueprintheartandmind.com is one of them. We're talking about social media. It's a way to use, follow your Facebook, follow your Insta, those sort of things. Give us two books real quick, if you can, before I
Sure.
let you go.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my absolute favorite ministries is Wild at Heart, John and Stacey Eldridge. One of the many books that he wrote is How to Get Your Life Back. Fantastic. Cannot recommend it enough. Another one that John Eldridge actually recommends in that same book is called The Shallows: What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains by Nicholas Carr. Two really, really good resources. I definitely recommend checking them out.
Well, and you yourself have been a really, really good resource for us today here on the drive home. Thank you as always whenever you join us, folks. I've been talking today in the 4 o'clock hour with Brooke Ackerman, the CEO and principal of Blueprint Heart and Mind Coaching, blueprintheartandmind.com. Or you can find her in the digital space. If there's something that we have said today that you're like, oh, I want to go back and hear that again, or I just, came in, halfway through, good news. Hey, guess what? You can go to WAVA.com, click on the show, The Drive Home. Click on this day in this hour, and you can have it all to yourself on your podcast, on your drive home, maybe you're on the treadmill, or wherever you might take in those sorts of things. But again, Brooke, thanks for being with us on the show. Don't go anywhere, folks. When we come back at the top of the hour, we're going to talk about the Chief Legal Counsel of Humanable. Humanable.com is helping people trying to understand what generative AI is doing in music and why it matters to us. This is The Drive Home, and we'll be back in the 5 o'clock hour.